So, first question I have here is, can a priest receive communion multiple times a day? What do you think? Yes and no. If a priest is saying Mass multiple times, he can receive communion. But if he isn't saying Mass, he can't receive communion any more than anybody else. So that's only twice a day. And actually, by law, a priest is only to say one Mass a day. We can only say a second Mass if he has special permission. But because the world is the way it is and the shortage of priests, we just generally have permission to, 2 Masses is called bination, 3 Masses is called trination. So there was a time that I was saying 5 Masses on a Sunday. So each of those times I can receive communion. But let's say I had a weekend I didn't have any Mass. Just like you, I could if I went to 2 Masses, I could receive communion twice, but that's it. Okay, does that answer the question? Okay. That's a good one. We're going to hold that one. We're going to hold that one. Do we need to go to confession every month? What do you guys think? Why do you say no? What do you think? Tell me why. You say no, but why? You don't know? Yes?
It depends on if you sin and if you intend never to in communion.
Yeah, if you commit a mortal sin, then you got to go to confession. Is it possible to go 6 months without committing a mortal sin? You don't think so, Max? Really? Not for you. Okay. Well, it is possible that you don't commit any serious sins for several weeks. I think it's a good idea to go to confession at least twice a year. If you have need to do more, because there's grace to the sacrament. So every time we say the prayer at the beginning of Mass, I confess to you, my brothers and sisters, every time we do the penitential rite, your venial sins are forgiven. But at the same time, some people feel very strongly that if they went to confession on a more regular basis, the grace from the sacrament would help them avoid committing sin. So that's a good thing too. So it just depends on where you're at, okay? But certainly, you should go to confession at least twice a year. That's why we require you to go for Advent and for Lent. And by the way, make sure you get going. There's confessions on Saturday, Tuesday, and Thursday. So make sure you get to confession during Lent. All right? Any questions on that? When did the name God turn into us calling him Father? Who asked that question? Not a bad question, I just want to know who asked. You think it was you? Yeah. Because the question is kind of phrased weird. So when do we start calling God Father? Is that what you guys want to know? Nobody remembers who wrote that question? Just trying to get what you were getting at. So is that what you were? When do we start calling God Father? Yeah. Well, all through the Old Testament, God is compared to a loving parent. In some cases, he's referred to a mother, like a mother hen gathers her chicks. But Jesus is the one that really made it intimate. So we can say, remember when you guys were little and you had, I think you still had those reading books like I did when I was a little kid. See Dick run, 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 yeah? Then they referred to your dad and mom as mother and father. How many of you, when you talk to your mom and dad, say mother and father? You say mom and dad, right? That's more intimate. So Jesus took the idea of father and made it something intimate, even more than mom and dad. He said that God was daddy, Abba. So when you think about when you think about the way you talk to your own parents, there gets to a point that you stop saying mommy and daddy, right? Are you guys at that point? No? Okay, you're at that point, all right. Well, when you really get in need and you're desperate, sometimes adults will cry out, mommy, because that's so ingrained inside them, and it's that intimacy that you have with your parent. So Jesus said that's the kind of intimacy we should have with God. So we call God Daddy or Abba. So Jesus really took that whole concept of God is like a parent and turned it into God is like an intimate parent that loves us really, really desperately. Again, any questions? You guys make this so hard for me. Do you realize I'm trying to make life better for you? That religion shouldn't be so dull, and you guys are just staring at me like what's that all about? All right. What is the church's opinion about outdoor weddings? Are they valid? Do they have to be in a church? To have a valid marriage, you have to be married before a priest and 2 witnesses. Some dioceses, it's what they call particular law. So some dioceses will allow outdoor weddings. It's like at parks and different things. Other dioceses, like our diocese, will not allow that. So you could appeal to the bishop for special permission. It is not a question of validity, it's a question of legality. So is it legal or is it not? So it still can be valid, but not legal. So, but if you get married without a priest or deacon and without witnesses, then that's not a valid marriage. Why do you girls especially, why do you think those laws exist? Do you have any idea? This is why a lot of times the church gets hit up because they only have male priests, but the church's rules were mostly formulated for girls. Because in the Middle Ages, women were not considered people. They were considered things, property that was owned. Also, women had to, just like they do today, they have the biological burden that they're the ones who bear children. And so oftentimes when a female has a child, the child is her responsibility. And ideally that responsibility is shared with someone she loves, her husband. But what was happening was when people started traveling from village to village. Imagine you lived in a tiny little village. St. John would be an enormous city compared to the villages people lived in. So maybe 300 people lived in your village, and a visitor came, and he was worldly. He had been to the big city, and he had fancy clothes, and he took an interest in you. He made you feel special, and he wanted to become intimate with you. And you said, no, I have to be married. And so he would say, he'd fall to his knee and say, please, will you be my wife? And they would exchange promises someplace, like in a barn or something. And then the next thing she knows, she's pregnant and he's gone. And she says, we were married, but there's no evidence that she was married. And so there's no way of holding him responsible. And in a small village in those days, if a girl got pregnant out of wedlock, her family had nothing to do with her. She was shunned. Have any of you ever seen the movie or the play Les Miserables? No one? Really? They have? You've seen it. Okay. Well, Andrew's seen it. Well, you should watch that. It's a musical, but it's also was the first novel ever written. And it tells the story of a young woman who that very thing happened to her, and she had no way of supporting herself. And it was a very hardship on women. So the church came in, and the church made a rule that said no marriage would be recognized unless it's done before a priest and 2 witnesses. Then they ran into the problem that these traveling guys were going around, and they were married to somebody else, and they'd come into your village. You didn't know anything about them, so then they would propose to you and marry you, and then they'd marry somebody else. So then the church made another law that said in order to get married you had to post 3 times banns. They call them banns. So anybody, remember that line, if you've seen it in movies, if anybody here knows the reason why this person shouldn't be married, let him now speak. Well, that's what banns were. So they published the banns. So if anybody from that village or another village found out, no, I know that person's married to my sister-in-law, they would stop the marriage. So many of the rules that the church came up with. Do you know why we have holy days, for example? Just to make you go to church another day? Where do you think we have holy days? What's the reason for holy days? Not exactly. I mean, those are special occasions that we celebrate, but there was another reason behind the church. Because in those days, there was no unions. There was no rules, labor laws. So people who owned vast properties had people working on those properties called serfs. So you were a nobleman or you were a serf, basically. And if you were a serf, guess what? You worked 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. And that was not human. So the church came in and they created a law. And they said, on this day, there'll be no work. So you can't, first they made Sundays holy days. So you can't work on Sunday. And then because people had no vacations or no time off, that's why they had so many holy days, so people would have an opportunity to not have to work all the time and be able to have festivals and something to relieve. That's all because of the Catholic Church. None of that would have happened if not for the Catholic Church. So especially girls, you should be appreciative of the fact that the Church has been looking out after your interests more than any other nation or country in the history of mankind. It was the church who's changed the whole. It's so funny today because people who are non-believers, they've taken our values that the church held and they're holding out those values. But when you have a value that's not centered in Jesus Christ, the value falls apart. So, all right. Here's an interesting question. Why did God make Lucifer the angel if he knew Lucifer would become the devil? What do you think? Max? No. That's exactly it. God's given us 2 amazing gifts. First gift is life itself. We're alive. Without that gift, there'd be nothing. The second major gift that God gave us is free will. We make our own choices. So a lot of times when people say, well, why does God allow bad things to happen? Well, if God prevented the consequences of your actions, or let's say the actions even of evil people, you would no longer have free will. The very gift that makes us special is free will, and God took it. If God were to take that away from us, we wouldn't have it. Yes, Max? Yeah, it is, actually. People make choices. Diseases come in large part, for example, lung cancer, heart attack. A lot of that comes from the behaviors that people, we know if you smoke, you have a higher chance of that. If you're overweight, you make choices to eat too much, you're going to have cholesterol problems, you're going to have heart disease and different things like that. People make choices. And furthermore, free will isn't just your choice. He chooses to get in a car intoxicated, and that intoxicated car hits and maims you for life. It wasn't your free will, it was his free will. So the fact that we all have independent free wills, there's consequences to all our actions. And so what God can do is to be with us during those times. I use this example, and maybe you guys remember this. How many of your parents have told you, do not play with fire? Okay. How many of your parents have told you, do not play with fireworks? Okay. So I'll give you an example. A boy in our parish decided to play with, what do they call them, M50s? I don't know what they're, M80s, okay. So he was playing with this stuff, and the thing blew up, and his whole arm was burnt badly, rushed to the hospital. His parents were called, and they ran into the hospital, and I was with them shortly after they got there. Do you think the first thing they said to their son, I told you not to play with M80s, you're a terrible person, you're a horrible son? No, the first thing they did was try to comfort him and support him. The fact is that the consequences of our actions are not something that God goes after us and blames us for, but those parents, no matter how much they loved him, could not take the scars that are on his arm even to this day. Every time he comes up to communion and I reach to give him communion and I see the scar on his hand, I remember that day. God got him through it, but God's not going to take away the consequences. So you make choices, and the consequences you have to live with. Or, is even worse, you make choices and the consequences somebody else has to live with. So, yeah, Max? Well, when we think of free will, this is going to blow your mind. So right now you're thinking about free will, about your choices. Cosmically, the universe has free will. God has created the universe with free will, and things act upon each other. Viruses come, diseases come. Choices that perhaps Andrew's great-great-great-grandparents made genetically had consequences. Every entity that exists has a portion of free will. And sometimes those things that act upon each other create consequences that are terrible. What I'll tell you about Andrew was God was with him all the way through. And God's grace got him through that. I do think that the power of prayer is very important to get us through difficult times. And actually that's what a miracle is, that God intervenes into the consequences of life and changes it. But we don't know who God's going to do that. Jesus, when he walked the earth, healed lots of people. He didn't heal everybody. It's hard to get your head around. But think of it, free will. And when you have this kind of free will and all the consequences that are bombing around, all kinds of bad things can happen. But God did not do that to Andrew. God got Andrew through that. All right? How much time do we have? 10 minutes. All right, I'm just going to answer some of these questions. We're going to hold on those difficult ones. The next time we get together, we'll just break immediately into small groups, okay? All right, I'm going to just ask this question of you, because this is a good question. And I'm going to point to you. Since you're just going to stare at me, I'm going to point to you and you're going to tell me what you think, all right? How do we get to heaven? Andrew?
A lot of people think you should follow the 10 Commandments and you get to heaven. If you break them, you can't get to heaven. And you go to confession, it's like a restart button kind of. But like you kind of have to make a relationship with God the same way you make one with your friend or with your parents or anything else.
Very good answer. What do you think about that answer?
I think that you have to like pray and like have a relationship with God and like go to confession.
How's your relationship with God? Would you say that God is a good friend of yours or an acquaintance of yours? Honestly.
I'm not sure.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. Bill, what do you think?
Like praying and having a relationship with God.
All right. So certainly following the Ten Commandments would be important, not breaking sin. Can you not break sin and still not get to heaven? Can you be sinless and still be denied heaven? You're saying yes. Why?
Probably because you could like go around and like say that you don't sin at all, but like you could just like not notice that you're sinning or just like you can like not want to get to heaven, like you wanna go to hell, like just
Why would someone want to go to hell?
I don't know, some people are messed up.
Yeah, I guess so, if they want to do that. Yeah. Yeah, I got the microphone there. Would you give the microphone to her because I like her response and I want that on tape.
So you could like say that you don't sin at all, but like you could still sin, just not notice it.
Okay, can you talk about that? How can you sin without sinning?
Like you could just like believe you're doing everything right, and like just not like have a relationship with God.
Mm-hmm. You can get really rigid about rules, can't you? So the Ten Commandments are rules and you follow those rules rigidly, but in following those rules rigidly, you're not compassionate, you're not empathetic, you're not loving, you're cold. Is that a reflection of who God is in our life? No. So God is calling us all the time to come to Him, and He wants us to become more like Him. And so God is not just a rule follower. Why do we have rules to begin with? What's a rule in your house? What do you have to do before you go to bed every night? For what? What?
Turn off the lights so the light bulbs don't burn out.
So night bugs don't bite, okay. Well, what are some more, Josie, what's the rules you have before you go to sleep? What do you have to do?
In my house, if you don't do all your chores for that week, then you get like all electronics taken away. You don't get your allowance for that week. You have to work until next week. You might get your stuff back if you do everything.
All right, just before you go to bed though, hold on the microphone. What do you do?
We have to say prayers as a family. That's a rule.
Okay.
One person has to do the dishes every night.
I'm thinking about just before you go to bed, what do you have to do?
Oh, like brush your teeth, wash your... I didn't know you meant like that.
Yeah, well that's a rule, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well if you don't brush your teeth, what happens? Give her back the microphone. What happens if you don't brush your teeth?
They rot.
They rot. So rules are there to help us, prevent us. Why do you think the Jews had rules against eating pork? You know, Jews can't eat bacon, they can't have pork.
Those animals could have gotten sick
How?
because they ate things that might hurt humans.
That's correct. So if you eat pork, not so much these days because they do things with the meat, but if you ate pork, let's say in the 50s, and you didn't cook it thoroughly, then you could get trichinosis as a disease. So in those days, they didn't have ovens like we do today. They used to roast things on spit. So the outside of the meat got burnt and the inside of the meat got raw. So the rule came out, why did the Jews have to wash their dishes and cups and do all that? Which they turned all this into like religious rules. What was the reason for that? If you at your home took a dish, let's say your sink is full of dirty dishes, and you took a dish from the dirty sink and you put food on the dirty dish and you ate it and you repeated that for days, you're making a face, but what would happen? What do you think would happen to you?
Probably get
You'd get sick. So the Jews came up with a rule that you have to wash your plates and your utensils and your cups before, and you have to wash your hands before. And that was long before any science told them this. They just observed that if you don't do those things, you get sick. So the rules that we have in our lives, oftentimes which we get upset about, that we have to follow these rules, especially when you get to your age, you don't like some of the rules your parents have, do you? Honestly? Yes, you do like the rules? You don't like the rules. But you have to remember the rules are there to keep you safe and to keep you from being harmed. Okay, our time is up. Next time we'll take the other questions. Thank you.